Hello and welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. Today I'm going to ask you a question that you think has an obvious answer. What is the last book in the Old Testament? And you go, well, that's obvious. It's Malachi. I can just look in my Bible and it's right there. Just before Matthew, at the very end of the Old Testament, is Malachi. Well, if you're Jewish and you look at a Hebrew Bible, the last books are the Chronicles. It's not Malachi because Malachi's lumped in with the other prophets and the miscellaneous writings that are called the Ketuvim, the writings, with Psalms and the wisdom books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and so forth. And then it ends with the Chronicles, and you go, okay, well, maybe that's the difference, the difference between Christianity and Judaism. Well, I'm going to argue that really the last book of the Bible is Daniel and should be Daniel for a couple of reasons. One is that people have often been confused by Daniel because they think, well, it's written during the time of the Babylonian exile when they, in 550 BC, BCE, around then, because that's what it's talking about. It's talking about Daniel being dragged off to, with all of the other leadership of Judea or of Judah being dragged off to Babylon and how faithful they are. The only problem is it's very, very clear that Daniel was written much, much later. It's probably most likely the last book written in the Old Testament that is part of the canonical Old Testament. In fact, there's some precision about this. Biblical scholars look at it and say because of the references of historical events, it's very likely written between 167 and 165 BCE, and that this is quite clear. Now, even if you don't believe that, even if you say, oh, well, maybe Daniel was talking about the future. Well, the other part of it that's very clear is that the language does not fit ancient Hebrew at all. Half of Daniel, so from chapter 3 through chapter 7 or so, is written in Aramaic. And Aramaic is the language of Jesus. It's the language of Palestine in the 2nd century BC through until a few centuries later. And Aramaic was spoken very widely. It was sort of the vernacular, and so first of all, the language didn't exist. That form of Aramaic really didn't exist that much before. Secondly, is that even the Hebrew part, so Daniel's this weird hybrid, is that the first couple chapters are written in Hebrew, then it's written in Aramaic through chapter 7, and then chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew again. But the style of Hebrew is very weird. It's very clunky, actually. It looks like it was written by a non-native speaker of Hebrew. And that would kind of make sense because by the time we get to the Hashemonian period, they call it, during this, the time of near the Maccabean revolt is what this time is. By that time, sort of Hebrew wasn't really the language that people thought it was. It was a liturgical language. Much like Latin is in the Catholic Church or in other churches today, is we retain Latin for a lot of reasons. A lot of works were written in Latin. Of course, the Catholic liturgy, traditional Catholic liturgy is in Latin. We use Latin for scientific and medical and things like that. But nobody speaks Latin. The closest language to Latin today is Romanian. But even then, that's not Latin, right? But we use Latin, and it's the same way for in this period in Palestine, Israel, is that people used Hebrew, but they used it liturgically, and they looked backward. They read the old scriptures. So it really, really looks like Daniel was written by someone or a group of people that were using Hebrew in a sort of a clumsy sort of way rather than a natural speaker. And then they switch into Aramaic, which looks like it was written by a native speaker, by a fluent speaker. So you can see that even just textually, Daniel is late. And you go, well, big deal. What's the why? Why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons. One is that Malachi was chosen as the last book of the Old Testament canon because it looks like Malachi is looking forward to the coming of Jesus. It has that sense of being a good bridge. Malachi looks very much like it was written, because it is written in good Hebrew, and it looks like it was written when the other prophet books were written. It could have been in the Second Temple period. It could have even been before the Second Temple period. But because of its content, not because of its age, not because of its language or anything like that, because of its content, it was chosen as the last book because it seems to bridge. You see that in a lot of the minor prophets, like Zechariah seems to look forward, have a future view to it, things like that. But that's the only reason why it was chosen that way. And certainly, like I said, the Jews in the Hebrew scriptures, these prophets were not the last books. And of course, they're not trying to bridge to the New Testament as Christians are. So to them, it makes no sense to just choose the prophets as the last books. Instead, Chronicles is chosen because it kind of sums up the story of Israel and the story of Judah for the people in their worship. Chronicles was most likely written around 300, 400 BC, BCE, and it was most likely written around that time. And that was during, solidly a few, and they call it the chronicler, which is kind of the word for the priests that were pulling this together. And it was written for that purpose, to give the narrative that the Jewish people needed to thrive and in this period. And that's what it was for. So they had no reason to put the prophets last. The prophets were more about the past and their endurance through the exile and through the rebuilding of the Second Temple. But for Christians, they don't, of course, Christians, we look at history a little bit differently. We say, oh, well, the Old Testament is leading in and is going to be fulfilled with the New Testament, and so forth. There's another piece of this that is interesting too, and that is that there's a whole bunch of deuterocanonical, which means, what we call the Apocrypha. These are the books that you see in the Catholic Bible, and you see in many Bibles that we have nowadays. And these, of course, have the Maccabees in them, and they have we have Baruch, and we have Sirach, and Tobit, and other apocryphal books between in the intertestamental period. And this intertestamental period between the prophets and the Second Temple period and the beginning of the New Testament. And that gives you a clue about Daniel. So Daniel is definitely, like I mentioned, one of these later books, and it is filled with imagery that fits the times. And because the literature had changed quite a bit in this period. It was much more about endurance literature. So we even have Esther, which is also quite a late book. And Esther, is definitely telling the story of where Piram comes from, and where the saving of the Jewish nation from from the Persian kings, right? And also talks about the the transition to a Jewish nation and endurance. So when you read the Maccabees, especially, there's a lot of discussion about martyrs and about Jewish martyrs. Also, apocalyptic literature always comes out of times of great stress. So Daniel is by far the most apocalyptic of the Old Testament books, filled with imagery that got picked up, of course, by Revelation famously. So when we read Revelation, we're seeing it's modeled after Daniel in many ways. It uses a lot of the same imagery, and it has that same way of kind of code, talking in code about kingdoms and stuff like that. And it's left up to us to decipher how to use that. So a lot of people do that with the book of Daniel. They say, "Oh, well, they're talking about the four kingdoms in Daniel," and you go, "Well, wait, where does this come from?" It's nothing like the older, true Hebrew texts in the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible. It's definitely much later. There's a little bit of that in Job as well. Job is written in a way in relatively good Hebrew, but has an old-fashioned-y sound to it. It'd be like a little bit like modern English speakers trying to write in the way of Shakespeare, for example. You see this in movies a lot, right? Where they'll make the dialogue sound like it's 300 or 400 years old in order to fit the scenes. Well, Job is written in that way too. So for a long time, people thought Job was a very ancient book, an old book, and it's definitely not. It's definitely much later, and but it was written in this style to make it look old. And you go, well, okay, so you have Esther, you have Job, you have Daniel, a few other books, but what do they have in common? They all have this endurance myth in them. They all have this idea that that the people are under persecution, and they're under persecution for their religion. So this is unlike earlier narratives where those people were under stress because of invasion and other issues, or internecine strife and warfare between the tribes. These books and these later narratives are much more about being under stress for persecution and preserving Judaism for the future. So that's what Daniel is, and that's what it's there for. So we have a couple of stories to tell us why. One of the things is that Daniel is such a fun book. It's so filled with great stories. It's filled with dreams, and Daniel is famous for interpreting the dreams of kings, of King Nebuchadnezzar and King Belshazzer, which Belshazzar succeeded Nebuchadnezzar. So, and then the endurance myths are like when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those three men, that's their Babylonian names. They have Hebrew names as well. And when they, in a fit of rage, Nebuchadnezzar throws them into the fiery furnace. But God saves them. He looks into the furnace and he sees four people. Well, it turns out that fourth person is an angel, and that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the furnace without even a singe on them at all. So that's an endurance myth, right? And then we get another one after Daniel is interpreting dreams and stuff like that. We get another one that's very similar. In a fit of rage, King Belshazzer comes and throws Daniel into the lion's den. And he does this. Why? Because he has edicts that say that Jews are not to practice their religion openly, and Daniel does. And he refuses to go And this, if like I said, if you read the Maccabees, you see this all the time. It's like the king, the government, or whatever is telling the Jews that they can't be Jews. They can't worship like Jews. They can't keep their practices. And they go through terrible persecution for this, especially in Second Maccabees. So Daniel fits right into that. Fits right into that persecution. And again, of course, the miracle is exactly the same in that Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. He comes back, and the king comes back, and guess what? Daniel's not even touched by the lion. The lion's mouth is shut. But that's the storytelling part, and that's the part as children we learn those stories. We love them, and they're fun all the way up through chapter 6. But then you go to chapter 7, and that begins the dream sequences, and how chapter 7 is about Daniel's dream and then the interpretation of it in that. And you get all these crazy images, and you get these images of the it sounds and looks so much like Revelation. It's not as maybe it's more limited than Revelation, because Revelation truly is being presented as end times, whereas Daniel's dreams and prophecy is being presented as not the end of the world so much as the end of the current age and what will happen with the kingdoms. And so there's no there, but it still has, it has lions, and it has horns, beasts with horns and crazy stuff like that. He says, after this, this is verse 7 of chapter 7, says, after this, I was continued to watch this night vision. I saw a fourth beast, terrifying and hideous, with extraordinary power and massive iron teeth. As it ate and crushed its feet, smashed whatever was left over. It was different from all the other beasts, and it had 10 horns. And, I was staring at the horns, and then suddenly a small horn came up in between them. It just this kind of language. And it's fun to read, of course. And the idea is that people have spent a lot of time saying, oh, well, this is the Roman Empire. This is the Persian Empire. This is the Medes. This is all these different groups. And, I think that's honestly a kind of waste of time. I kind of think that's a little bit of a waste of time in Revelation, too, to try to decipher it as if it's some sort of secret decoder ring. No, it's just apocalyptic literature, and it was meant to give the people a sense of hope. It was meant also, ironically, to mock empire. Maybe not as openly as Revelation, but it's the same story and why it's there. So, okay, if it's the last, and it's pretty clear that if it's not the last book of the Old Testament, it's pretty darn close. Why does that matter? It matters because it tells us so much about the zeitgeist, the thinking at the time, what it was like to be in this period. A lot of what we read about in apocalyptic literature and what we read about in the theology, the resulting theology that we have in Christianity, comes from this period when Judaism started taking on a lot of Greek themes and Greek myths. Remember, during this period, the Jewish diaspora was happening. People were leaving Palestine and settling all over the Mediterranean. So by the time Jesus comes on the scene, a century and a half after this, the majority of Jews actually did not live in Palestine or Judah. The majority of them lived through communities all through the Mediterranean and in the Roman Empire. So a lot of them lived in Alexandria. There were a ton there. There were lots in Asia Minor, in Galatia, in Rome. We know this because of Paul's letters. We know that there were Jewish communities all the way over in Morocco and Spain. So it had already happened. And this is why, through persecutions, there were definitely persecutions, there were pogroms, there were all kinds of things, but they'd already spread around. And what did they take with them? They took with them the Hebrew Bible and their liturgical Hebrew practices and their scriptures, but they also melded it with the lingua franca at the time. So Aramaic was mostly spoken in Palestine, in that area. Most Jews spoke Greek, and especially in Alexandria and in Asia Minor, in Greece and places like that. And now, of course, they spoke Latin in Italy and other regions. So, but it was clear because, remember, Roman society was filled with Greek myth. There was Greek myth throughout the Roman pantheon and Roman religion and everything, and and Greek philosophy. So a lot of these ideas, a lot of these Platonic ideas, were made their way into Judaism as well. Also, some of the imagery about the dualism of heaven and hell, for example, really starts to get developed during this period too. So if you look at Daniel, along with the Maccabees and the other books, the deuterocanonical books, you can see that this is the soup, this is the culture in which Jesus came, in which the disciples came, in which the Pharisees were. You can look at the Pharisees being the ones that were trying to hold on to something, or even go back to something that was a more pure Judaism. And you could say maybe that's Jesus was doing a little bit of that too, trying to go back to something more pure. But that was in the air. This the apocalyptic type language we hear from Jesus, which isn't a lot, but there's some there, So of course, we have the goats and the lamb, or the goats and the sheep in Matthew 25, and there are others. Is there, and that why is that there? Because that's the world in which the Gospels were, and of course we see a lot more of that in the end of 1 Corinthians, for example. 15, 1 Corinthians 15. We also see it in 1 Thessalonians. A lot of the talking about the end times being imminent, the end of the world, the return of Jesus being imminent. And then, of course, the big headliner being Revelation. Revelation was just one of many apocalyptic books, literature, that the canon, the people who assembled the canon, could have chosen from. There are many of these. Revelation looked like it was the most complete and maybe fit the theology the best, so that's why it was chosen. But you look at that and go, well, Revelation was clearly written at the end of the first century, maybe even the beginning of the second century. Daniel's written in the second century BC. So there's hundreds of years between the two, but in between is a lot of this apocalyptic type thinking, end of the world kind of thinking. And when you have people under stress, this is the way they work. This is what we do. There's a lot of apocalyptic thinking going on in modern times, right? It came up especially with dispensationalism in the 19th century, John Nelson Darby and the Scofield Bible. There was this feeling that with all the industrialization and terrible things happening, and then really when you had total war coming about, started with a civil war, went to the Crimean War, then to World War I. That was a period in which war became very hell-like, just absolute shock to the people. Well, and then with the rise of technology and so much change with things like scientific revolution and things like the rise of technology and the rise of evolution and things like that. People just were very disoriented. And when people get disoriented, they start thinking the end of the world is coming, and that they have imagery and literature that support that. So how do you deal with that? Well, you can go, well, I believe it, and I'm going to try to decipher it and try to navigate my way through scary times, thinking that the rapture is coming or something like that. Or you can just look and just kind of stand back a little bit and say, this is the way people behave. And this is what people do when they're under a lot of stress. This is maybe you could say it was a coping mechanism. Clearly, Revelation was written as a coping mechanism. It was written to very, very frightened people, beset with all kinds of change and social pressure in first century Asia Minor. After the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and all of the oppression happening from the Romans. So you go, okay, well, that's the way people behave. The same thing is true with Daniel. That's why we have Daniel there. That's why I think it's really important to realize and to think about Daniel in this way, rather than talking about the exile. It's really about people who use the stories of the exile, very formative part of Jewish history, very much part of their myth-making and their nation-building comes from the exile and afterwards. And they use this in the context in which it's being written, with this apocalyptic type storytelling and imagery. And then understanding that tells you why the New Testament was written the way it was, and the soup in which this arose. And that can really enrich your understanding of these books. That's why I loved having Dr. Lynn Huber on my podcast a few episodes ago. She just has this incredible ability and her commentary to kind of put that into perspective, so that instead of looking at these books with fear or with shame or driving you to bad behavior, you can look at them with love and grace and fascination, because they are fascinating. Daniel is a fascinating book, and especially in its time and where it was and what it led to. So with that, I'll say people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there. That people will look at Daniel in ways that really aren't all that helpful, but there's so much more than that. So with that, I'll say thank you for listening, and God bless you.